Okay, welcome to the Chapter 21 overview, Collapse and Recovery of Europe, 1914 to the 1970s. The first half of the 20th century was dominated by two world wars and an economic depression, which eroded the global influence of Europe in favor of powers from other regions. Relevance. So, the first half of the 20th century created the political world we live in today, and most of the current political issues we face are directly connected to the events discussed in this chapter. Conflict in the Middle East, including the rise of terrorism, political struggles in Africa and Asia, and economic interconnections are all with us because of the two world wars that devastated Europe and the rest of the world. So, setting the stage. In Chapter 17, remember, you learned about Enlightenment ideas and the revolutions that followed, which created expectations for freedom and independence around the world. In Chapter 18, you learned about the Industrial Revolution, which increased the size and power of militaries. In Chapters 19 and 20, you learned about the effects of industrialization and imperialism on Asia, Africa, and the Americas. In this chapter, you will see that these forces all collided in three devastating events of the first half of the 20th century: an economic depression and two world wars, which ended the global dominance of Europe and transformed the political landscape of the world. First heading is called the First World War. A main idea statement is, the First World War was caused by Europe's competitive drive for global dominance, and its effects had a profound influence on international relations until the next World War. An accident waiting to happen. For Europe, the events that caused World War I were really very similar to those that caused its rise to power in the 18th and 19th centuries. Huge armies were sparked by industrialization, competition for resources around the world, and the most important cause was nationalism. The most powerful nations of Europe were inspired by nationalism to compete for power. If you look at this map here, in purple we have one alliance in the war. We have Great Britain and France and Russia as being three significant European powers. On the other side, what we call the Triple Alliance, was Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Smaller nations were also sparked by nationalism to want independence from these large empires. The most significant of them is going to be Serbia, right here, which is worried about influence from the great empire of Austria-Hungary. When the war started, new military technology created unprecedented losses and shattered the continent. To the rest of the world, the weakness of the European order was exposed. The next section is called Legacies of the Great War. World War I had a number of significant consequences for Europe and the rest of the world. The concept of total war expanded authority of government over the lives of citizens, setting the stage for the totalitarian governments of the next 2 decades. Disillusionment with the ideals of the European Enlightenment caused people to feel like the system of European political thought was broken. There were new nations created in Europe and a communist revolution in Russia. There'll be more on that revolution in Chapter 22. On this map here, you can see in green the land that's lost by Germany as a result of the war, right here. You also see in yellow land lost by the Empire of Austria-Hungary and the creation of these new nations. And in this sort of brown color, these were territories that were lost by Russia. The Treaty of Versailles devastated Germany, creating resentment that led to Hitler in World War II. There were other nations that expected independence but lost it to something called mandates of the victorious countries, especially down here in the Middle East. In yellow, the mandates of Britain, and in pink, the mandates for France. And these are going to have repercussions through the 20th century in terms of political disillusionment and discontent in the Middle East. Another significant cause was the final collapse of the Ottoman Empire into a new nation called Turkey, and resistance to European rule in the colonies of Africa and Asia. And finally, one of the legacies of the Great War was the rise of the United States and Japan as world powers. After World War I, capitalism seemed to fall apart. Here's a main idea for this heading. The worldwide depression of the 1930s questioned the capitalist system, leading to various attempts at reform, changing the relationship between government and the economy. As you can see here in this map, you can see unemployment in 3 countries, the United States in orange, Great Britain in green, and Germany in pink. And unemployment was a huge problem that resulted from the Great Depression. In some cases, the numbers are around 35%. Industrialization had been based on free market capitalism, with little or no government influence on business. By the 1930s, this was not working anymore, so people turned to a variety of alternatives, which your book will discuss. State-sponsored socialism in the Soviet Union is one of them. The New Deal in the United States is another, and extensive government control over the economy in Germany. In this section, the book describes some of these alternatives and their effects around the world. In the next red heading, we lay the foundation for the causes of World War II, and it's called Democracy Denied. In the 20s and 30s, Italy, Germany, and Japan shared a basic ideology of authoritarian and highly nationalistic governments, eventually uniting as the Axis powers during World War II. First heading is called the Fascist Alternative in Europe. Fascism is a political theory invented largely by Benito Mussolini in Italy. Here he is in this photograph with Adolf Hitler. Fascism denies individualism in favor of service to the state. In fascism, the government is the most important thing in your life. In the 20s and 30s, this appealed to a lot of people. Businessmen who lost a lot in the Depression of the 30s, unemployed lower-class workers, and nationalistic citizens frustrated by the losses of World War I. In this section, you will learn about the rise of Mussolini in Italy, the first fascist ruler. The next section is about Hitler and the Nazis. Many people do not realize that Hitler was elected the ruler of Germany legally. What caused the people of Germany to turn to such an extreme ruler? This section explains many of the causes of the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, and they include the Treaty of Versailles and the apparent failure of the new democratic government in Germany. Similar to Italy, reactions to economic problems caused by the Depression, opposition to perceived threats to German nationalism, including communism and the Jewish faith. As the leader of Germany, Hitler enacted both economic reforms. If you see on this graph here, unemployment stayed relatively low in Germany. Right here in 1932 is about when Hitler took power. And also, Hitler enacted social changes that devastated the enemies of the state, which represented the moral failure of Europe. And here, as the book describes, is an anti-Semitic poster in which Hitler devised an enemy of the state as the Jewish people. And finally, Japanese authoritarianism. After World War I, Japan seemed to be moving in a more Western and democratic political direction. The right to vote was expanded, and the right to education, and customs became more Western. With the economic collapse in the 30s, there was a conservative reaction to this, especially among the military. Unlike Italy and Germany, there was no single leader to unite this movement, but in the 30s, the military had increasing power over society, so that by World War II, it largely controlled the country. In this picture, we have high school students in Japan in 1940. Many people in Japan supported this role, especially given its ability to recover from the economic problems of the Depression. So these three nations, Italy, Germany, and Japan, will largely contribute to the causes of World War II. The Second World War, even more devastating than the first, caused profound shifts in international relations and the continuing decline of European influence in the world. The first heading is called The Road to War in Asia. Intense Japanese nationalism and the increasing influence of the military on Japanese politics led to the invasion of China and Southeast Asia. Here in the 30s, Manchuria was invaded. Japan will eventually expand all down here to Southeast Asia. Eventually, that led to the attack on Pearl Harbor, here on this map, which drew the U.S. into the war in 1941. The resulting conflict was largely a naval war in the Pacific, with intense fighting on key islands. And that's what this map shows, the major battles. Here's Iwo Jima right here as an example of World War II. United States conquest of these islands eventually led to the atomic bomb attacks at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending the war in 1945. The road to war in Europe. In Europe, the aggressive nation was Germany, which took over territory in Austria and Czechoslovakia. Here is Germany here, and it expanded to the south to Austria and to the east into Czechoslovakia. The League of Nations, created after World War I to maintain world peace, proved unable to stop Hitler, relying on an ineffective policy called appeasement and giving in to Hitler's demands in an attempt to avoid war. When Hitler invaded Poland, Western powers declared war, and it took 3 years to halt and eventually reverse the expansion of German territory. This map, everything that's kind of a yellow shade, represents the greatest amount of territory controlled by the Axis powers, and that's primarily Germany. They didn't conquer France and much of North Africa. They were allies with Mussolini in Italy, and the Germans expanded into the east, across Poland, and into much of the Soviet Union. And it was a long struggle to reverse those gains by the Germans, and eventually, right here in the center, the Germans surrendered in May of 1945. The next heading is called The Outcomes of Global Conflict. The war had a number of significant effects. Unprecedented military losses, especially in the Soviet Union and China. This graph shows that, and here you can see this is the loss of China, and these are the losses of the Soviet Union. Germany is down here, and by contrast, the United Kingdom and the United States are right here, much less, and that's going to become important later. The horrors of the Holocaust were also a devastating effect of the war. The increased responsibility of women in the workforce, the declining influence and power of Europe, especially in their imperious colonies, leading to independence movements, which you'll learn about in Chapter 23. The extension of the communist world, leading to the Cold War, which you'll learn about in Chapter 22. And the last significant effect of World War II was new efforts to maintain peace centered on the United Nations, which we still have today as our primary global peacekeeping force. The last red heading is called the recovery of Europe. The cooperation and influence from the United States helped Europe to recover from the difficulties of the first half of the 20th century. So, Europe recovered from the first half of the 20th century for three main reasons: the ability of industrial societies to recover from hardship, the willingness and ability of Western Europe to cooperate after the war, especially economically, and the influence and aid of the United States, both economically with the Marshall Plan, which was a system of foreign aid from the US to Europe, and politically with NATO. The result was increased European integration, culminating in the economic consolidation that we have today called the European Union. And on this map, all the countries that are a purple shade represent joining this economic integration of Europe called the European Union, beginning in the 70s and going into the 2000s. So now it's time for the 10-second spice review. Both world wars changed the roles of women, leading them to be more involved in industrial economies. The two world wars changed international relations and led to the creation of international peacemaking organizations, which were largely inspired by the horrors of war caused by new military technology and ethnic violence. The Great Depression led to an increased economic role of government and international integration. Finally, the visual summary. Industrialization and nationalism were the key factors that caused World War I. After World War I, there were two key conflicts, both political and economic. Those contributed to the rise of fascism and authoritarianism in the 20s and 30s. Those contributed to World War II, and the effects of World War II were political integration with things like the Marshall Plan and NATO, and economic integration, especially with the European Union. That's our overview for Chapter 21. Happy reading!